So this next panel, as Carl said, is about methane emissions. The title is something about should we treat them like oil spills, which is really just about how to decide how many methane emissions are okay and in what context, or to put it the other way, when are we going to start fixing them more quickly? It will cover, I think, both the distribution sector and transmission. This morning we have with us Jonathan Peress, who's an attorney with the Environmental Defense Fund, and EDF has been doing a great deal of work in studying methane emissions, sponsoring scientific studies, and a great deal of policy work both at the state and federal level. And also Dr. Subramanian, I'm hoping I'm not screwing that up, who is a senior research scientist at Colorado State University and one of the authors of one of the studies that EDF has sponsored. Spoiler alert, there will be math. But first we're going to hear from Jonathan. Our third speaker this morning was intended to be Morgan O'Brien. He unfortunately had to cancel only a couple of days ago because of a conflict that came up quite suddenly. So I have asked Jonathan, as I did last year actually, to fill in for another speaker, and he has graciously agreed to talk about some of the work that utilities and operators have been doing in voluntarily trying to reduce their methane emissions. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Jonathan.
Thank you very much. Jonathan Peress, Environmental Defense Fund. I am the Air Policy Director. I focus primarily on midstream, interstate pipelines, and downstream LDC work. Before I begin, I very much want to express gratitude both to Rebecca, to Carl, and to the Pipeline Safety Trust for a small shop of 3 people. Not only is their profile very large, but their impact is very large. And to that point, I want to mention that last year when I was here, I had lunch with Robert Miller, who is the safety director in Arizona and is the outgoing chair of NYSEARCH, and we got to talking about some of the studies and some of the things that EDF is doing. And he said something to me that day that really I've never forgotten and has really informed a lot of the work that we've done. Since then, he said, and this is pretty much a quote, "All utilities must use the state of the art in terms of processes and methods to enhance and to operate safely." And he said all utilities must be working to advance the state of the art. And he was kind enough to invite EDF as well as the Pipeline Safety Trust to present at the NYSEARCH annual meeting, where I was able to meet and interact with all of the state safety directors and have maintained those relationships and am in pretty much constant contact with some of those directors, which has really helped us advance our thinking about the work that we're doing to find and quantify methane emissions and how that interacts with safety. And that's really the focus of my presentation today. In addition, I want to thank the folks at PHMSA, really to a person, all the way from the new administrator down. They've been very open to data and information and input from EDF and have it really, I would say, demonstrated a commitment to transparency, which has been extremely helpful to us. Last thing I want to say is many of the ideas, before I start, many of the ideas that I'm going to discuss are forward-looking policy ideas. So they're not all necessarily the positions of EDF organizationally. Some of them are my positions. Basically, I'm going to make 5 points in this presentation, and I listed them there. And the first one deals with a little bit of the backdrop to EDF's Google mapping project, where street view cars have been equipped with Picaro sensors, and using new methods and techniques, we are quantifying leak flow volume from local distribution companies and to some extent also other facilities. And where this has led us over the past year is not just about putting out information, but in terms of demonstrating that using techniques like this provide benefits to all the key stakeholders, including customers, utilities, the environment, and now we're really focusing on how we can enhance safety with some of these technologies. And you know, I don't want to overstate the state of this. These are forward-looking ideas, but I think we're seeing a lot of movement from a number of utilities about how these kinds of technologies can be integrated into state-of-the-art programs, and then we'll talk a little bit about next steps. I'm going to start with a very brief review. Actually, this material about methane in general was presented last year. Dan Utek and my boss, Mark Brownstein, spoke. And we know that methane leaks are a problem that really up until recently have not been characterized adequately, both from the standpoint of sources and quantities. And that's ultimately what EDF's commitment has been with the studies, which Dr. Subramanian will discuss in a little bit more detail. And of course, the reason is simple, because methane is a very powerful short-term climate-forcing agent, 84 times more powerful than carbon dioxide over 20 years, which means ultimately that if we're going to have a successful and meaningful climate policy, we need to address both methane as well as carbon dioxide and other GHGs. So just by way of very brief background, I'm guessing that most of you are familiar with the Google mapping project that EDF has been undertaking and collaborating with various utilities, Google and Colorado State. Certainly if you go to our website, you can learn about our positions and also what the results of that mapping project have been. You can see that what we're doing is we're basically trying to create transparency to show really what a significant problem methane emissions are, both from an environmental standpoint as well as a safety standpoint and also a customer standpoint. So just very brief background in terms of how the program works. The data is collected by these street view cars, which are driving around creating street view maps for Google. Working with Colorado State, they developed an algorithm doing controlled release experiments that measure the methane concentrations, the wind speed, the direction, and the location. They do multiple passes going relatively slowly. And what they do is they kind of get a picture of the spatial extent of a plume. And by understanding the spatial extent of the plume, they can also rule out whether it's anthropogenic or biogenically created or anthropogenically created. And they've come up with a set of algorithms in order to process that data and come up with what I'll call rough quantification numbers of the leaks that we're finding. And we validated those algorithms through controlled release experiments. So if you look at our website, you'll see, for example, that we've now released data on about 7 or 8 cities. That's just an example of what we found. And I think the key thing when you look at this compared to where this project is going and as it relates to safety is these dots are indicative of where we found methane driving over streets. They're not necessarily attributed to infrastructure, to utility infrastructure. So when we say that we found 200 leaks, or when we found 1 leak per mile driven, that's just based on what we're finding on the road. It's not necessarily being correlated to utility infrastructure. That's the direction that we're taking the project now, which I'll discuss in a minute, but just to go through the background, what we do is we basically bin the leaks to low, medium, and high. Low is 700 to 9,000 liters per day, medium is 9,000 to 50,000 liters per day, and high is greater than 60,000, and high is greater than 60,000. So you can see the red dots. You can see there's a few high leaks that were found in Boston, and on our website you can drill down and you can click to really get very more specific information relating to the locations of our findings. That's the backdrop. That's kind of where we started with this program. But based on discussions that I had with people like Robert Miller, with the pipeline safety representatives from the various states, and frankly, with some very forward-looking utilities and regulators, we kind of came up with a new idea for this project, and that's a big part of what I want to talk about today. In the first instance, we can use this data in a very practical way. We can validate the need for and the benefits of pipeline replacement programs for utilities that have a lot of predominant leak-prone pipe. In addition, we can use quantification to prioritize the areas that utilities focus their efforts and customer resources. Ultimately, it becomes a cost-effectiveness tool and a project management tool. And I'll get into that in a minute. And of course, when you prioritize based on size, one of the co-benefits is also, and we're not suggesting to not prioritize based on safety, but to consider size, and I'll talk about that in a minute, but you reduce lost and unaccounted for gas, which is almost a double externality. The emitting entities, A, do not pay for the cost of those greenhouse gas emissions from a societal standpoint, and B, it's actually customers that pay for that gas that's lost and not delivered to homes rather than the utilities. We also, of course, want to put out public information so that customers, so that the public, so that policymakers, so that mayors realize why these projects are important. And so there's a couple of, I think, excellent real-world examples about how this technology can be used in practice. I'm not sure if there's anyone here from Illinois, but if there is, they're undoubtedly familiar with what's been going on with the Peoples Integris merger and the petitions filed by the Attorney General there questioning the way that Peoples Gas has been managing its almost $10 billion program to replace infrastructure. And I just took this column out of the Chicago Trib, and you can basically see that the report, which was issued by the Illinois Commerce Commission, questions not only the program's overall effectiveness as it relates to safety, but basically whether it's actually having any impacts on reducing gas leaks. So when you think about that and you look at the kinds of technologies that we're trying to bring to bear, the light bulb goes off. And actually we've had a utility, I wish Peoples were here to talk about it, who said, you mean we can run this technology before we start a program and then after we complete a program to demonstrate the benefits that we're providing? Yes, you can. But more importantly, in the face of this in Chicago, I'm not going to name him, but a smart utility regulator in Chicago said, I'm really concerned that what's going to happen here is that the baby's going to get thrown out with the bathwater. That the concerns about cost effectiveness and management are going to lead to decisions that basically take the whole program and say we don't need to be replacing these pipes any longer. And that regulator said, isn't there a way that we could start structuring your technology so that we can help utilities better manage what they're doing? So indeed, lo and behold, only this week, the Board of Public Utilities in New Jersey approved a settlement for Public Service Electric and Gas's project to spend approximately $1 billion to replace their leak-prone pipe. They have more cast iron pipe in their system than any other utility. And I wanted to make a couple of points about this. I circled the comment that was made in this article by the ratepayer advocate, Stephanie Brandt, who, by the way, has been fantastic to work with. And this was right when the project was proposed, and this is kind of a typical response that you get from consumer advocates, sometimes PUC staff. The first thing they'll say is, how do we make sure that we minimize the amount of ratepayer impact that comes from this? And how do we minimize the size of the project so that ratepayers are not adversely affected? And what we have noticed, and EDF has been intervening in these proceedings around the country, is oftentimes that advocacy is completely disconnected with what the facts are with respect to the infrastructure and the leaks. It's something along the lines of, we're not going to allow anything more than a 1% increase in rates, end of sentence, without any meaningful connection to the facts under the ground. I'm going to take this a step further, actually, and I raised this at the NAPSR meeting. Another thing that we found is that in most states, but not all, the pipeline safety folks that work in the same departments are not there answering the questions of staff and rate counsel about what needs to be done and what the conditions of the systems are. And we discussed this at length at NAPSR. There are a number of reasons for that. I'm going to point out, just as an excellent example of a couple of folks that are really deeply involved in this, the folks from the Pennsylvania Investigation and Enforcement Bureau, where the safety director, Paul Metro, sits, have been deeply involved in these proceedings relating to Philadelphia Gas Works. And we'd like to see that happen all over the country, because I want to be frank about this. What's happening is we're getting into these cases, and we're getting into technical conference, and we're looking at our data, and we're getting questions from the utility regulators that actually their own safety representative undoubtedly knows the answer to. And sometimes the utilities play it a little bit coy, so EDF is the one who's become the authority in some of these cases about what's going on under the ground, which seems to me to be a kind of a strange outcome in terms of why the environmental advocates are the ones that know or can basically provide more information about what's happening under the ground, but that's the way it's happening right now. So just to continue here, the reason that prioritization and leak quantification surveys work is because virtually all of EDF studies, and I'm sure Dr. Subramanian will talk about this, find that a small fraction of sites contribute the majority of emissions. The purple curve, the one farthest to the right, the steepest curve with what we call the fattest tail, that's based on the Washington State study of distribution company emissions. And if you look at the 4 highest dots, you find out that just 4 sites out of approximately 220 that were measured were responsible for 50% of emissions in that study. So what that means is that cost effectiveness, and for that matter safety, will be enhanced by understanding where the biggest leaks are. And I don't want to overstate the issue of this is still technology that's in its developmental stage. I would call it pilot scale technology. When you look at one individual leak, you don't find that that necessarily the methods that we're using are that accurate. But when you put together a large body of leaks, almost the bigger the sampling size, the better the technology works, because what it allows you to do is rank leaks from top to bottom. And it actually ranks fairly accurately, and it bins fairly accurately. So this cumulative distribution curve, basically the blue line shows the measured releases, the actual, the measured releases that were specifically to see how well the technology does, and the red line shows what the technology showed. And if, for example, you wanted to achieve a reduction of 50% of the leaks, you could get to the top 6 highest leaks, and based on our technology or the methods that are being used by us and others, you would find that you actually, the method showed 47%, you would get to 45 to 47%. So it's not perfect, but it's a pretty good indication of prioritizing the leaks from biggest to smallest. So now just to show you how this would work in practice. So when we worked with one utility, I'm actually going to say who it is, Public Service Electric and Gas, they gave us the location of their infrastructure. So the blue lines show where the car drove, the black line shows where their infrastructure is. And they asked us to help them, as I mentioned, in understanding where it would be most cost effective beyond safety for them to repair and replace pipe. So what we did with that was we took the parcels that they were proposing to repair, and this is just one of them, and we attributed leaks directly to the pipeline infrastructure in that region. And there's other companies that are starting to do this. We'll talk about that in a minute. But on the right is where we showed the highest verified concentrations of this section. And on the left is actually what our data and algorithms suggest can be clusters of leaks. And what we found in this service territory is there were 4 leaks. Now, granted, these were parcels that they've identified for replacement, 4 leaks per mile of infrastructure in our review of the 30 parcels, which clearly validates the need for some pipeline replacement and helps to prioritize it. And I just want to specifically discuss a couple of utilities that are moving forward with this kind of methodology. Pacific Gas and Electric made an announcement, and we've been working closely with them. They're doing this independently. They didn't do this obviously because of EDF. They did this because they want to enhance and improve their safety programs. So they're using Picaro equipment with an algorithm to determine and volumetrically size leaks. They've put together a whole new way of doing this, both from a GIS standpoint and from a responsiveness standpoint. And then the public service electric and gas case, which I mentioned below. And essentially that quote comes right out of Public Service Electric and Gas's press release on the settlement that was just approved on Monday. And indeed, the Board of Public Utilities actually relied on the fact that EDF is working with them to prioritize leak replacement based on volume in their decision. We're working with a host of other partners, including through NYSEARCH and some efforts that they're making both to look at this technology and to validate it. As I mentioned, People's Natural Gas of Pittsburgh is seeking to do before and after and integrate this into their regular operations. And it's important that all of the stakeholders, consumer advocates, safety regulators, the public, PHMSA, and state PUCs recognize that there is some real potential to using volumetric quantification, both from a prioritization standpoint, but also from a safety standpoint. And everybody here, I think, knows the backdrop about the call to action from DOT and the PHMSA DIMP program. I think, some of the key principles that underlie those programs is to use all reasonably available information in evaluating the severity and threat of leaks. And in fact, we heard Administrator Dominguez come in here and talk about trying to be more predictive, trying to be better, trying to integrate data and visualize data more successfully. And then when we look at this in the context of leak backlogs, and this was mentioned in passing by Commissioner Honorable, I mean, in California, there are tens of thousands of leaks. Massachusetts has thousands of leaks. Some of these have been leaking for 20 or 30 years or more, and frankly have never been quantified. In general, the utilities are using the emission factors to size those leaks. The volumes and quantities have never been measured. And what we would submit is that there is a safety benefit to using quantification. And what I've done here is replicated a very basic outline of a hazard assessment algorithm, a predictive model that utilities are using. As an aside, I would mention that most utilities are not willing to publicly release their hazard assessment algorithms, which we suggest is problematic. This is from a public filing, and so it basically describes the different components of how the utility is assessing hazard, and you can see a major aspect of it is the potential consequences from a leak. And they're essentially using operating pressure as somewhat of an indication of what those potential consequences might be, along with, of course, proximity to building envelopes. And what we would suggest is that actually using leak flow volume, leak size, is an actually more accurate measure of what the potential consequence factor is. And at PHMSA's risk modeling workshop of about 5 weeks ago, virtually everyone we spoke to about this agreed. If you could come up with an accurate way for quantifying, then that belongs in the risk assessment algorithm and can enhance those algorithms. And it's not just on the distribution company side. This is from a presentation Boardwalk made at that workshop. Boardwalk, the Interstate Pipeline Company, and they talked about their algorithm, and one aspect of their algorithm is to look at indicators including leak history. And I actually asked the gentleman who presented this, I said, if you could quantify leaks in a cost-effective and efficient way, would you put that into your algorithm? He said, absolutely, that would enhance the safety and the program. So there's certainly a lot more to do when it comes to operationalizing this. This is a forward-looking concept, and what we would like to do is continue to work with utilities, continue to work with pipelines, continue to work with PHMSA. I want to suggest that voluntary natural gas STAR program, directed inspection and maintenance is not a replacement for this. For among other things, while DI&M programs recommend the benefits of quantification, they're basically based on a voluntary assessment by the pipeline as to whether it's cost effective to repair. So what we're really talking about is using quantification as a safety tool. I promised Rebecca that I would talk a little bit about, and as an entree to Dr. Subramanian's presentation, so I think many of you are familiar with the various studies that EDF is undertaking, a total of 16. They're almost complete at this point. There's a synthesis paper that probably will be published in early 2016. At least 30 papers are coming out of these studies. This is just a representation of the various parts of the supply chain where we have helped to characterize emissions, and Dr. Subramanian will discuss that a little bit further. The one point I wanted to make is, and I asked this question of Jeff Weiss yesterday, one place where there has not been a good characterization is in gathering lines. And that's a very difficult challenge. But we already know that gathering facilities, not including the lines, are one of the largest sources of methane, much greater than what the greenhouse gas emissions inventory at EPA would suggest. And there is certainly a lot of anecdotal evidence to suggest that gathering pipelines, the legacy system, are emitting at a much higher extent than the inventory expresses. That's an issue that we need to address from a safety standpoint as well as from an environmental standpoint. You probably know that because most gathering systems are not regulated by PHMSA, they're not even reporting incidents. So we actually don't even have a good database on the extent of those incidents. My colleagues send me texts, articles all the time of incidents on the gathering system. And also, just to touch on the proposed methane rules, I'm not going to go into any great depth on these. EPA has proposed regulations for new and modified sources that also get to transmission systems, including compressors and other equipment. Those are still out for comment. EDF is working on comments, so I don't want to get too specific about those, but certainly we applaud the administration for moving forward in doing this. We would note that many of the options that EDF has, that EPA has put forward are cost effective in terms of improving leak detection and repair practices, in terms of modifying or putting new compressors with dry seals in. And so, we'll be filing comments in December. The real issue that we have with this rule is that it doesn't address existing facilities. It's only new and modified facilities, which of course diminishes what its benefits will be, both from an environmental and a safety standpoint. So just to sum up, data and information and new methods are important to advance all of these interests: customers, safety, environmental, and actually utility regulator interests. And I'm mindful of what Robert Miller said: maintaining and advancing the state of the art. Everyone benefits from having information the way that we and others are putting it out there, and are some of our utility partners. Methods like this can resolve that disconnect between expenditures and proposals for pipe replacement and the actual facts under the ground. And using this data and integrating it into these programs will give everyone a better idea of what can and should be abated. So with that, I'll turn it over to Dr. Subramanian, and I look forward to any questions.